Welcome everybody to another episode of the AppSec Engineer podcast. And today is a very, very interesting episode. We've got Naren from Verisk. Hey Naren, how's it going?
Hi Rahul, nice to be online and nice to speak to you after a long while.
Yeah,
How are
it's
you
been a
doing?
long while actually. I mean, I was kind of looking into some of our earlier conversations, and I think the last time we met was almost like 5 years ago when Verisk was still Fintelix.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah, and
Yeah,
and at that time, iCreate had just become Fintech, so we just
yeah,
gone through a rechristening process when you guys
yeah,
met us
yeah,
for the first time.
yeah. How's it?
And
How's it been, Naren?
it's been good. It's been an interesting journey, and I can specifically say so with respect to what the organization that we built, starting back in 2006, has shaped up to become. It's been interesting for us from multiple aspects. One, the kind of markets that we've gone to since the time we've become part of the larger Verisk family, markets that we otherwise didn't really focus on or couldn't get entry to. We've been able to get in there. It's interesting because we've also been able to work in an organization of scale, which, being who we were, going from 40 to 100 to 200 felt like scale, but going from 300 to being part of a 9,000 member family feels definitely like scale.
Right.
So it's been interesting because the type of work that we've been doing has also kind of taken a little bit of a steer, and we've moved into also insurance. So while it's a different domain, given today's context, I don't think it's very different either, right? Given that we've been in the data business for banking, looking at insurance, it seems like a very similar journey. And probably to me, the insurance world seems like it's retracing the same footsteps that banking went through once upon a time. So that's how it's been.
Like we said, so talking about AppSec engineering in general, and like I mentioned in the introduction as well, you've been in the banking and financial sector for predominant amount of career, if I'm right, right? So you've kind of started off in the BFSI
All
sector,
career,
all career,
whatever
yes.
career I've had is all been
Right.
banking.
No, so interesting. So, Naren, give us a snapshot of how you've seen, at least with respect to security and application security, and feel free to touch upon any other domains. But what do you see as a very prominent kind of transition that's happening across BFSI over the last, I don't know, what, a decade or so?
Yeah, look, I started off my career, mechanical engineering graduate, but I ended up in IT because that's how
Yeah.
fate would have it in India.
Yeah. You know
I
what
ended
they
up
say,
showing.
do engineering only to understand what you don't want to do in life.
Well said, well said.
Yeah.
So, well, if that's the case, then I'll probably have to rewind the clock a bit now. So, so started off with TCS. In my early days were programming something that everybody would ask me what that was, which is COBOL in the banking industry, because that still seems to be fairly pervasive there. And we were building a core banking transformation program for the State Bank of India, which was arguably one of the biggest that Asia had seen at that point in time, right? But if I think about that journey from the way I saw it, right? I think that time the focus was on getting centralized capabilities for the bank, right? And in a way, security was there, but it was kind of in the background, really, right? It was not really in the foreground. Was not as much importance because it still wasn't in the hands of every retail customer like it is today, right? I mean, internet banking was unheard of in India at that point in time, right? And I still remember some of the foreign banks that came to India and started offering some of these again to corporate and HNI customers seemed like a big thing for the Indian banking industry, right? And I still recollect even in those times writing checks to people or even depositing checks myself for any transactions I needed to do. So if I went back, I think that was the period where we were focusing on getting, the whole core banking in, transformation and getting all the banking centralization happening. And that was when the move to making branches more of like the equivalent of a retail store started, right? So enabling them to become processized, enabling the customer experience to be standard, irrespective of whether you went to a branch in a tier 3 city or you went to, the Mumbai Cuff Parade branch, right? So that was kind of where it was. And at that time, I think security was primarily associated with uh, you know devices being plugged into the network. And I still remember I was part of the early team there, so we did VLAN, the first big Superdome server, which itself was a big deal for us, right?
Yeah.
It was like 32 processors and 64 GB RAM, which sounds like a couple of cell phones put together today,
Yeah.
right? But it was still big for us. And when we brought it in, there was another device that came along which was fairly big. And when I asked what it was a firewall. And at that time, I don't think I understood what it was. All I knew was it prevents bad actors from getting into our network and doing anything of sorts. But that was pretty much it, right? Didn't really understand how things work. Even internet proxy seemed like a more like an easy ease of use kind of tool. It didn't seem like a security related aspect to any of us. And in fact, when we rolled out the core banking software and it was browser driven, right? None of us even worried about is there possibility to inject anything through the URLs? Is there cross-site scripting we could do? I mean, forget about cross-site scripting. JavaScript itself was in its very early days at that time, right? And if I contrast that to the journey that's happened since, right, and the way technology and digital adoption has grown in this industry, right? I guess today the first question we get asked when we go and speak to a customer about, hey, why don't you consider using our solution or our data platform for aggregating your internal data and doing whatever analytics you want to? First question is, how secure is it, right? Do you encrypt data? If I contrast that to 10 years ago, the question was, how much does it cost? Right. So it kind of puts things in perspective. What's top of mind clearly shows, right? And the fact that everyone's been watching very closely the kind of digital frauds that are happening, the way people's digital identity is being compromised, misused, abused, and so on. I think it has come a long way, right? And I guess security has become part of life rather than being thought of as a afterthought, right? Which is what it was probably 10, 15, 16 years ago when all of this kind of started. So that's in a nutshell how it's been,
Yeah.
and that's kind of the journey I've seen.
Talking about transitions, Naren, I think an interesting point that you brought about is that I feel there are two kinds of transitions that's happened in the BFSI segment from security perspective, right? One is obviously the transition that you talked about, where you're essentially talking about security being transitioned from just a network and an infrastructure standpoint to a lot more focused on software per se.
Right.
And the other transition is also the motivation to implement security has moved from largely a compliance driven initiative to more proactive based decision as well, right? Is that something that you're seeing as well?
That's absolutely true. And I think it's also to do with what's at stake. Right? If I wound the clock back, I think what was at stake at that time was somebody doing something in our network, in our infrastructure. And that's how I think like you said, it was about perimeter infrastructure. It was about the infrastructure really. It was about making sure our switches and network endpoints were all secured and set up right. But at that time, I don't think the value of data, one, I don't think we were collecting that much data, right? Secondly, the value that people associated with data was not as much, right? I think the interest was more to prevent a fraudulent transaction from happening within that localized area. But today, with the extent of digital transformation and everyone's put, I think, practically leading more of a virtual life, especially in these COVID times than ever before, the data is not just compromising you there, but it's compromising you pretty much everywhere in the digital world, right? It's almost like it's a seamless transition from, hey, I mean, if my PAN number, I mean, we didn't even have PAN, but let's say even if my passport number got leaked 15 years ago, I would not be as worried as I'd be today because I don't know where it can be used today, right? And I mean, think of a telephone number, right? I wouldn't panic as much today if I lost my wallet than if I lost my cell phone. And that,
True.
I think, is clearly a reflection of how much you value you associate to the data that you hold and the data that identifies you so clearly, right? And I think that is what has changed that perspective, right? It is what's at stake. And today, what's at stake is not a localized phenomenon to that particular software tool technology, but it's something that can put your entire portfolio, your entire life, and entire set of things that you do at stake, right? I mean, people can hold you to ransom in the virtual world, technically, right? If they get hold of everything there is about you that is available, and I think that's caused the sudden shift, right? It was a gradual slope where it started with, like you said, purely infrastructure, perimeter security, those kind of things. Then it became a little bit about on the browser, what are we doing with respect to ActiveX controls? What can Flash was a big deal, but Flash had its vulnerabilities. How can you deal with it? Those kind of things, and that was a gradual slope. And then I think ever since the advent of the smartphone and the apps and everybody using data on their phones, it's just it's hit the proverbial hockey stick sort of a curve in terms of awareness and importance, both, right? It's not just that people are aware, but they're also find it very important to talk about it, right?
One of the things that I always kind of believe and also talk about with people is that today any company is a technology company, right? It doesn't really
Absolutely.
matter which domain you're in. But kind of taking that back to the initial part of our conversation where we said that, look, security probably started off at a phenomenal scale, or rather at a significant scale from the banking and financial industry. And then
Absolutely.
cut to 2020 today, where there's kind of some kind of innovation, some kind of disruption on a technology sector that's happening in any industry. So, do you think that the rate at which innovations in the technology sector, or specifically, let's say, innovations in the security sector, happened, let's say, a decade or 15 years ago in the banking and financial industry, do you see the same kind of innovation happening in the BFSI segment today? Or do you think that with, let's say, coming up of the Ubers of the world and the Facebooks of the world, generally, do you feel that security innovation has kind of moved away from banking and financial into possibly other sectors as well?
Slightly different perspective, Rahul. Like you said, everybody's a technology company today. I think I'd extend that to the next level as a corollary, saying every technology company can now be a bank, right? Or let's say conduct some sort of banking business. It may not really be a bank, but can conduct banking business. And we're seeing it with the number of fintechs that have been showing up, trying to address either very small slivers of the market, or addressing a particular segment of the market that is underserved or is not being served by the rest of the banking industry. And in a way, we're seeing the banks moving to becoming, let's call it this, a service provider, right? They're providing services that will enable people to do business while they're actually becoming the technology hub for it, right? So the equivalent of the cloud providers for infrastructure, they're becoming the equivalent of cloud providers for the open banking initiative, which is taking over everybody, right? And they're saying banking's the same. It doesn't matter who, you don't care who is your banker anymore. You care who's the guy who's providing you the experience now. So if I tied it into that story, the question that you asked me, I believe that security has, in the last 8-10 years, right, really changed its definition, its meaning, and its importance in this world, right? In the BFSI industry across. And I can say it with a lot of conviction, given that we've been associated as an organization in helping banks and financial institutions solve problems with data. And like they say, data is the new oil, and everybody's being as protective about it as possible, and holding it as close to themselves as possible. Again, I go back to what I said previous. It's what's at stake, right now. It's not reputation. It's not one transaction that you lose and you have to refund your customer. It's the reputational risk you run. It's the credibility that is at stake for you in the marketplace. Because if someone heard that we lost 20,000 accounts, data for 20,000 accounts, I don't think your customers want to sign up and use your app. I mean, all it would take is one incident for people to suddenly stop using your services itself, right? So if I also talk about what's happened to this world, I think the advent of the new technologies, right, especially around the web technologies, right, the whole JavaScript driven applications, including JavaScript reaching the server side with Node.js, things like that, and the extent of inter process communications, right? Earlier, it used to be one server call, one TCP message, one response, and you were done, right? Now, the browsers have become like a mini system in themselves, right? They can pretty much talk to so many end systems without you knowing and get you functionality there, which means there's that many potential additional points of failure, and people are being extremely careful about what they roll out and how they go about it, right? I do believe that it's going to change more, and with every adding additional new technology that we're bringing to the fore, and that banking and the financial services industry is adopting, it brings in additional challenges, vulnerabilities, threats that also come with it, right?
Right.
And dealing with that means that you have to probably innovate at a quicker pace than the technologies themselves are evolving, right? And
Right.
that's how I see it.
Let's shift gears to companies like Verisk and others being on the other side of the table in terms of providing services and platforms to your customers. Right now, you've kind of worked. I know that Verisk has customers across the board, from the US to the EU market to the Middle East and Asia Pacific. Now, when you sit across the table in terms of a negotiation of your platform, and you mentioned that, and what your customers ask you in terms of what you are doing from a security perspective, right? How is that question or that conversation changed over the last, let's say, 5 to 6 years? What kind of questions are you being asked today as a provider of a
Right,
fintech platform?
right.
One, and two, do you see any kind of striation of that question being asked across various segments of the geography? Is there like a difference that you see there?
Yeah, I think I'll answer it on all three axes that or vectors that you asked me. See, first of all, like you said, it's when it was, let's say, 7 8, even 7 years, 5 7 years ago, it used to be, are you checking all the boxes in my compliance? The ask of the clients at that time was, hey, we have a information security department. They have an audit formality. They give you a questionnaire. Can you make sure you answer it? And as long as you can answer the high priority ones well enough, I think we should be okay, right? That was kind of the perspective that people had. If I wind the clock forward to where we are today, I guess one of the opening conversations is around, one, what kind of uh, cloud services do you work on, right? Because everybody wants to leverage the cloud. And
Mhm.
almost 9 times out of 10, the second question is, how do you ensure security of the data that you're taking to the cloud? Right? Forget about what the cloud providers have to offer. What are you doing in addition to that to make sure, one, my data is secure, is anonymized or tokenized, so that nothing is compromised, even in case someone gets access to the data, and what are your fallback mechanisms to deal with it, right? I guess that is a clear change in where it lies in terms of value and importance to people today versus where it was 7 years ago. And if I add that angle of the different geographies that we've seen, I think I'll move from east to west. The Eastern world is probably still playing a little bit of catch up, and the emerging economies are still in the process of formalizing their security data and security related requirements and guidelines. They are there in pieces, because definitely, for example, in India, the RBI has taken the lead. They've gone about, announcing what people need to do in terms of cyber security, how they need to take care of their applications. In fact, even forcing people to have a process instituted before any application is rolled out into production environments to say that they get a certification of sorts from a certified partner slash accredited auditor, information security auditor. Now, if I move a little to the west, obviously the intent has translated to some policies and actions, right? They've launched the GDPR, and that's being pushed heavily. The extent of what data can reside where, who has ownership on that data, how that needs to be managed, how your application security needs to cater for different tiers of security within where they're being deployed, what is considered personal, sensitive, highly sensitive, or publicly available information. That whole demarcation and classification of information itself has become a lot more evolved, right? And as we work with clients in the EU, we realize the extent of impact it has on them when anything related to data and security comes to their mind, right? I believe the US has always, been ahead of everybody in terms of talking about the need for security and privacy and data protection and all of that stuff. So in a way, I would put them in the same bucket. But I think the evolution that's happened there is probably there are evolved providers and solutions that they have for being able to deal with these things, right? So that's how I've seen things evolve, one across markets and two across time, right? And that's how I've seen the BFS definitely industry change over time.
Yeah, personally at V45, when we kind of interacted with customers and things like that, and 5-6 years ago, when we worked with a banking and financial provider or technology or platform, they usually came back and said, "Hey, can you help us with this huge vendor assessment questionnaire that my customer has asked me?" And it's usually the same set of 300 questions, but asked in different shapes and forms and sizes.
Okay.
And to your point, I think to add to your observation, today it's much more, like you said, in terms of beyond the questionnaire. I know even customers today, or our customers, if I might say, are now coming back and saying, "Oh, no, leave these 300 questions alone. Now let's get to brass tacks.
Exactly.
Let's talk about, to your point, they probably want to poke more holes into the whole shared responsibility model of cloud
Correct.
provider, for example. I know you're
Correct.
using probably AWS or GCP or Azure, but talk to me about the devil in the details, and that's what I want to understand. I think part of that reason is, yes, the general awareness that's created.
Right.
And I also think that, talking about compliance and security, I think somewhere even compliance regulations today, be it the PCI DSS or the HIPAA, whatever is it, they've kind of done their extent of imbibing core security principles as part of compliance, so that
Right.
I know there are still organizations who probably look at compliance as a certificate on the wall for them, for their sales teams to go ahead and get
Correct.
customers.
Correct.
But then, thanks to the whole awareness bit of it, that you kind of have more of these questions being asked across the platform.
No, it's interesting you bring it up because not too far back when somebody was talking to me about the single DES and triple DES and all of that, it kind of sounded like, aren't you wasting your time on stuff you don't need to worry about, kind of
Yeah.
discussion, right?
Yeah.
And today you almost take it for granted that you better have that. I mean, nobody's even asking you if that's even something you do, right? PCI DSS used to be a big deal 5 years ago. Now everybody's saying, we assume you are there, and just like you said, tell me the detail, right? To the extent that 7, 8 years ago, clients even in the EU would ask us to say, while you provide your software and install it to us, and you're doing whatever customization or enhancements that we've requested, uh, send us your testing evidence that says you've tested the functionality and stuff like that, right? Cut to today, they're saying it's a given that you're going to test the functionality. We want to see security testing evidence, right? Of how you've done it. And what's important is, I think, they've also realized that they are as responsible as the software providers in the overall scheme of things. And they've realized that unless they really believe in it and put their heart and soul into it, just making it the responsibility of the software provider is not going to help, right? Because at the end of the day, your responsibility translates to a document which you sign off, but unless you really validate it, unless you go into the detail and you look at it the way you said, you will not be sure about it, right? So and I see that change in the way they approach it. It's more about, hey, don't hold back anything, right? Tell me what the problems are. It's okay, disclose your vulnerabilities of the software, right? Let's talk about the scenarios in which it can be exploited. Let's take a conscious decision to say, is it okay? Can I live with it? Is it only exposing me to a very, very small threat as opposed to a very large threat? What can happen, kind of a thing? And that shows the maturity that's building in this industry, right? People are saying you don't have to really be a 100% scorer. It's okay. It's okay if you're at 95, but tell me what the 5% is, because I'm more interested in knowing the 5% than the 95%. And that helps me make better decisions.
Yeah. You mentioned about the transition. When you talked about what customers want from companies like you, you moved from a transition from the east to the west, and I think that's very interesting because personally, and I'm sure you've worked in the US as well in the North American market. You've kind of you clearly see a demarcation between the east and the west coasts of the US by itself, right? The east coast of the US is largely what I'd like to consider the consumer market, where you have the
Right.
larger enterprises, you have the large retail and the banking organizations who are the large enterprises, who are the ones everybody wants to work with. And then you
Correct.
cut to the Bay Area and the Silicon Valley, and that's where you have product companies who are more the providers. Those are the ones that's where you have the small and the mid segment technology companies coming
Correct.
in and really kind of providing platforms and services. Interestingly, be it Fintellix or Verisk today, you kind of been a West Coast-ish company providing services to the East Coast yourself, right? I mean, you mean you're like a product company working with larger enterprises. So
I don't know if you're giving me a compliment or you're saying you're built from sheepskin.
no, but it's just interesting because as a technology provider working with larger enterprises, and at the same time you're in the banking and financial industry yourself.
Right.
How are you kind of managing expectations of your customers, at the same time kind of creating innovation within yourself, especially today with people talking about going to market faster, trying to
Right.
innovate, at the same time maintaining the balance between what your customers want from a security
Right.
perspective and maintaining what you'd want to probably achieve from digitization and things like that. How are you maintaining the balance, at least within Verisk?
It's a tough one, and I don't know if I really have a formula for that. But this is how it's been for us, Rahul. I think the primary focus as a software provider, and in your words, being the West Coast-ish company that we are trying to be, was always to get something that was different that people hadn't used before, right? Some addition functionality, some features, an offering that would fit into a space that otherwise was not served even within that largely served banking industry. But while we did that, if I think about, not even very far back, you said we first exchanged some emails in 2015, right?
Yeah,
Even at that time, I happened to be scanning emails as well, and I came across your email.
yeah, yeah,
And I remember me writing saying, look, I think we're still figuring out our
yeah.
development process and cadence and stuff. So maybe, Rahul, you're a little too early to the party here. I'll give you a buzz in a year or so from now.
Right,
And
right.
that's how it was, right? So we were at that time obviously focusing on bringing stuff out, and then saying, hey, what's more important, you getting a tool to use or you being sure that it's secure? What's more important? And I think if I did a poll today, it would be dramatically different than if I did a poll 5 years ago, right? Today people saying functionality and features are important as long as they come with a basic level of security that you can assure me of, right? And they're not creating a big gaping hole for me to lose my data or get compromised, simply because, again, like I said, the credibility is at stake, right? It's not just the fact that you signed off something and you made a mistake, but it's more about the fact that your credibility is at stake, right? And for us, we've had to literally change what I'd call our development culture, right? And while we've been engaged with you folks at V45, I must say that it took a lot of introspection from us. to say, what does it take to imbibe this whole concept into our culture, right? Because it did seem like our clients wanted us to take more ownership in in that space around security. They wanted us to be agile, provide new features fairly quickly, innovate, add new stuff, embrace new technology, right? But if I still, looked at it from a BFS point of view, we still, probably, I think a 2 3 year lag to new technology adoption, right? Technology is out there. I mean, and this is 2 3 years now, but 10 years ago it used to be 10 15 years, right? What some of the tech guys were doing was 10 years later was adopted by this BFS industry, whereas now I think it is a lot closer, but there's still a lag because we want to be sure that it's going to work in this context, right? We want to be sure that it is one, utility, two, value, and three, secure, right? And I think all of these three make the cut for the decisions, right? Whether it is Hadoop and the big data world, I mean, we started hearing about it in 2009-10, right? But only as recently as 13-14 did it really make an entry into the banking world to become mainstay. There were probably POC projects running where some of the early adopters were trying to evaluate the value and see whether they could get what they wanted out of it. But the real mainstream came in about 3 4 years later, and I think that's going to continue for a bit, given that it will always remain a little bit of what I call a cautious industry, right? It's not going to jump head first and adopt something without evaluating the value as well as the risks that come with it.
Then finally, I want to ask you a little bit about, you touched upon the development culture within the organization, but and that to me is a huge part of security transformation. And you might have all the best technologies in place, you might have all the best processes in place, but it really kind of boils down to that development culture that you have
Yes.
within the organization. And that to me is one of the most interesting aspects of application security, and it's something that's really astonished me when people implement these practices. So I this is something I ask everybody, and I want to have that conversation with you as a final thought here as well. Um, Two things. One, what have you done at Verisk for in terms of being able to imbibe that culture, the development culture of being closer to security? How have you kind of convinced slash motivated your teams in terms of adopting application security initiatives? One, and two, what kind of advice would you give companies of your size, companies in your space, who are looking to kind of make that next big leap? They understand that AppSec is important, and going back to
Right.
your previous thing, maybe they were where they were, where you were, they're where they are now, where you were 5 years ago when you sent that email saying that we still new, right? So looking back, what have you done differently, or what's worked for you? And at the same time, what do you think would be some of the advice that you would want to give to your peers in the product engineering community?
Look, I think I put it on two or three fronts, right? The first thing is, I guess, the belief, and I'd like to spend a few seconds just talking about my change in belief itself, right? What started off with, hey, okay, what do you need, Mr. Client? You want some sort of assurance that it's secure? No problem. We'll get someone on board. We'll speak to a partner, and they will come and do something, and we'll give you a certificate, and you should be happy. So it sounded like, uh, I don't want to, say this, but it's like some of the other compliance audits that happen, right? Whether it's your ISO audit for process or it is your CMM audits, etc. The organization, you believe that doesn't, you don't need to involve the organization, and in this case the organization being the engineering or the product development organization, no big deal, there's no need to involve them, we'll just get someone to do something, we'll make a few fixes, tick mark, and we're done. And I realized that if you want to stay on top of the game, if you want to stay relevant, it's not going to work with that, right? You can't make it someone else's problem, right? Otherwise, you'll end up with it being like any of the other compliance audits, where say every 2 years we get someone in, they'll do something, we clean up the act, we get a check mark, and we go forward. But unfortunately, we're not producing software only once in 2 years. We're producing it once in every quarter. So, which means it's a lot closer to that, right? So one, I think it's about belief from the leadership of the organization themselves, and saying that it has to change. So questioning yourself about how important it is to you, and obviously that as a reflection of how important it is to your clients gives you a clear view of what you should do about it. The second thing that we tried to do within the team was to try and get them to understand the impacts of these security pieces, right? Because at the end of the day, I think the most difficult part is, if I was a engineer, if I was a developer, I'd say, yeah, that's just a two-line fix, right? And no big deal. I just had to, encase it in something. I had to make the call different, and I would be okay. Yeah, it's just moving a get request to a post request. It could be as simple as that, but it isn't really as simple. And I don't think they understand the gravity of it until they see it in real life. So I guess I spent a lot of time with the team talking about the impacts of some things that we saw, right? And I believe, like you said, the devil is in the details. So I do remember sitting through for a couple of hours at least with the team on almost every issue we had or that was raised. And we went through it and said, what's the impact of this? What happens if I don't change it, right? Who can misuse it? And what do I stand to lose, or what does my client stand to lose if this happens? I guess building that awareness is important, and like anything else, right? Whether it is the development process, whether it is the tools, a lot of times people have asked me, why do you need project management? Big deal. Give me a requirement. I tell you how long it takes. We code it, we deliver it, and you're done, right? But we all know there's a place for project management, even in a product development lifecycle. And similarly, I think it's for us to help them understand the importance and the value of something like that in the overall scheme of things. The third is being able to make the right investment. So, first is belief and intent. Second is translating it to explaining it to your teams and the folks in the team. But all of that without any investment from you in that space won't really make the cut, right? So you probably have to invest in, one, gaining knowledge, two, in the right tools and technology that can become part of your development cycle and become integral to it. And I would kind of associate the last part to what DevOps and CI/CD means today. Long back, or not so long back, it was seen as, yeah, there's some people who do some server stuff, right? They'll install the database, they'll do backups, they'll deploy your code, and they'll get it to run. And it felt like an IT function. It didn't feel like product development function, right? And if you look at what it is today, it's become part of engineering more than it has become part of a general IT infrastructure kind of a team. And I think it's pretty much the same journey with security, probably, a lot more accelerated because of the importance of security in the new world.
Naren, a wonderful time talking to you. Thank you so much. I think it's been a while since we spoke, and I'm glad
Yes.
I'm glad we did this conversation. And I think there's a lot of interesting takeaways for similar companies in terms of the BFSI segment. And thank you once again for being part of the AppSec Engineer podcast, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, Rahul. Nice speaking to you as always. Keep well, stay safe.
Thank you
And
so
yeah,
much,
I'll give you a
Naren.
buzz sometime. All right.
Yeah. All
Take
right.
care.
Thank you so much.
Have a
Bye.
wonderful day.